conference. We are very excited to have you all here to train with us today. My name is Teresa Palacio, and I am the manager of the Fair Housing Assistance Program for the Community Relations Department with the City of Charlotte. And I would like to introduce you to our presentation team today. We are joined by Cameron Pruitt, president of the LGBTQ Democrats of Mecklenburg County, as well as our partners from Legal Aid of North Carolina. We have Jeff Dillman, who is the co-director for the Fair Housing Project, as well as Lauren Brazil, who is a staff attorney with the Fair Housing Project as well. And with the Fair Housing Assistance Program, we have Louise Mata, Rhonda Jackson, and Ashley Lewis. They are our trusted fair housing investigators. And we've all come here together today to remind you all how important your jobs are in terms of fair housing. So while many of our presenters here today are advocates, attorneys, and investigators, all fighting the good fight against housing discrimination, you all are really our folks on the front lines, and we're asking you to help us prevent fair housing violations. So we know most of our attendees here today are landlords and community managers. So in those positions, you all really have the ability to protect your residents and your communities from the discrimination that we're going to talk about here today. So with that, we will go ahead and start. We're starting with a quick text to poll. So if you could please take your phones out, you can join the poll by texting Willie R456 to recipient 22333. If you're having trouble, please go ahead and raise your hand, or you can make a note in the chat box. And I will get this open for you all. While you're doing that, I do want to ask that as we move through the training today, if you have questions, please make sure to put them in the chat box. We have a lot of material that we would like to get through, so please bear with us, but we promise that we will get to all of your questions at the end. The other thing I wanted to share is our agenda for the day. So we're going to start out with some brief information on who we are, what we do, what fair housing is, how it came to be, and then we will we'll see some local statistics and information regarding the LGBTQ plus community in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and then we'll take a 30-minute lunch break around 11:45 and return for a deeper dive into HUD's most recent memo on sexual orientation and gender identity. This is good. Optimistic, curious, people feeling interested, pride. That's all. Come on, I know there's a lot of you in here interested. That's good. That's good. So the larger the word gets, that means the more people are feeling that same way. So lots of you are interested and optimistic. That's very good to hear. Very nice. Much needed. That's good. That's an interesting one. All right, I will give you folks a couple more minutes and then we'll go ahead and stop the Wordle. Okay. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is exactly who we are. So the Community Relations Department is the human relations agency for the City of Charlotte and for Mecklenburg County. So part of that department is our Fair Housing Assistance Program. And we have the local jurisdiction to assist folks in filing fair housing complaints, investigate those complaints, require answers to our interrogatories and production of documents. We have the jurisdiction to administer oaths and depositions, issue subpoenas, and approve settlement agreements, and also enforce and monitor those agreements as well. In addition to that, we also have other housing related resources through our dispute settlement program. So that includes things like code violation referrals, magistrate court referrals, and our landlord tenant program, where we offer mediation and conciliation services to residents as well as housing providers. So in short, community relations is here to address most of your housing concerns. So what we don't specialize in or have specific answers to, we really pride ourselves in our partnerships with other city departments, as well as county departments, and then other local partners and organizations that we have. So if we don't have the exact answer for you, we do have the people that we can direct you to. So for more information on other resources that we have within our department, please visit our website at charlottenc.gov/CRC. That being said, this is our contact information for our Fair Housing Division. We are a very important resource that sometimes we think people might not know very much about. So we're not just here for tenants or for landlords. We're really here for everybody. We're here to educate, to investigate, to insist in all things fair housing related. It's really important to us to be ahead of the curve. So we're not really doing our job if we're not also preventing fair housing violations from occurring. So if you have a question about something that's going on in your community or at a property that is yours or that you know of, always, please just reach out to us first. We're never going to say, oh, we gotcha because you have a question and you're not sure what you're doing. If you have questions regarding fair housing, please always reach out to us. We are a resource that we really would like everyone to take advantage of as much as possible. So to get in the fair housing mindset, we're going to go ahead and watch this video that gives you some good background on fair housing, how it came to be, and where we are today. So please enjoy, and also let me know if people cannot hear this.
I'm not hearing it.
Oh, you're not hearing?
No, ma'am.
I cannot see it either, nor hear it.
Oh no. Okay, just one moment. Can everyone see this?
Yep, we can see it now.
Yes.
Yes.
How's the volume?
I still can't hear it, but I can see.
Can you share your computer sound? At the top of your screen, you click and then the right, share computer sound.
Where's that, Gwen?
At the top, go to the top of your screen and then your little thing drops down towards the right.
In video settings?
That top right. So you share computer sound. Yeah, I can't tell only because I'm not in the app with you.
I'm so sorry. I appreciate your patience, everyone. Thank you. I'm the world's worst millennial when it comes to technology. I should know, but
It's
I'm
all good. Do you have a view options
when I share my screen?
Yeah, I think when you share and when you don't, but definitely when you're sharing, I think view options toward the top. I think if you click there and that drop down is the option that the young lady was sharing, the share computer sound, I believe is in there. If you go up and hover around the view options, I believe it's view options. And
Okay,
then you
let's
click
see.
that.
Result of
Is this
private
better?
prejudices.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yep.
private prejudice
We can
clearly
hear it
Almost.
now.
contributed to segregation.
Okay, great. So let's try this one more time. Thank you all for your patience.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. in many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African-American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African-American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African-American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the 5th Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
So what is fair housing? Fair housing is your right to freely decide where you live, regardless of your protected class status. And that right is protected by federal, state, and local laws. In many municipalities like ours, fair housing law is enforced through local ordinances that are deemed substantially equivalent to the Fair Housing Act. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce Mr. Luis Mata to go ahead and take it away to give a brief refresh on our 7 protected classes before we go ahead and deep dive into sexual orientation and gender identity. Luis?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you everybody for participating, for accepting our invitation. It is very important for us that we all participate in this struggle, if you will, that we have to do just to make sure that we find people who need to understand their rights, but also that they know that we are here, the Community Relations Committee, the Community Relations Department are here to help people understand what are the rights and also what is it that we do in terms of enforcing the fair housing law through our fair housing local ordinance. As Teresa was saying, we are we enforce the local fair housing ordinance, which is substantially equivalent to the federal fair housing law. And because of that, we have 7 protected classes here in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. We enforce fair housing law here in Charlotte, but also in the non-incorporated areas of Mecklenburg County. So those protected classes are disability, color, race, national origin, familial status, religion, and sex. And one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation today is to expand in this new guidance from the government around protections under the protected class sex. So we're going to talk briefly on each one. We're going to give some examples, and then we're going to focus on sex. That's going to be the second part of our presentation after our lunch break. So the first one, race, is pretty much self-explanatory, even though race is just a set of physical traits, but there is no really a human subspecies. So we can, race in this protected class basically considers what has been a social construct around the differences, which are just external, if you will. So we protect the protected class race when we file or when we have a complainant. The first thing that we ask is, what are the bases for your complaint? So when they say, well, it's because of my race, I think I'm being treated differently because the way I look, that's when we investigate we file the complaint based on the protected class race. Next, Teresa, please. Religion is also a protected class, of course, and it's a system of human thought and spirituality. And we live in an area in this country which is heavily Christian, if you will. There are a few Catholics, we have Baptists, and we have people from different denominations. But the influx of people coming from other countries, and we'll talk about national origin also later, has brought also people with different beliefs. And when we do this intake, which is the conversation that we have with a potential complainant, we try to understand why they feel they were being treated, they were treated differently when they were trying to access, when they were looking for housing. And it can be in any real estate transaction. It can be when they're getting a loan. It can be when they're renting an apartment or a home, or when they're buying. It can be they can be treated differently when they're trying to have access to that housing solution, or they can also allege that they were treated differently while they were renting this unit. So religion is one of the protected classes also. National origin, as I said earlier, is people who come from another country, basically, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's someone who just arrived to this country. It can be, 3, 4 generations. I've met individuals of people that are for instance, California tends to have a lot of people coming from Asia. And I once had a conversation with a person of Japan descent, and he was commenting how sometimes when he spoke English, people would say, wow, I mean, where did you learn English? You have such a perfect English. And he has been 4 generations American for 4 generations. I mean, his ancestors were from Japan, but that doesn't mean that he's not considered an American, if you will. And when I was talking about religion earlier, when we investigate fair housing discrimination complaints based on national origin, when someone comes, for instance, from Africa, then sometimes they tend to be Muslims. So that can be another reason why they're discriminated against. I investigated a complaint. These 2 sisters from Syria actually believed that they were discriminated against because of their accent, because of the way they look different than than people living in their community. And when we're having the conversation, they actually talked about how they felt that maybe because of their rituals or the way they looked, the way they dressed, maybe had an impact also in their neighbors. And then they told me that they were Muslims. And then actually we added to the complaint, not only that they came from another country because of their national origin, but also because of their religious beliefs. So again, someone who is from Latin America and has been living here for a long time doesn't mean that they lose that national origin protected class, right? So color has to do basically, sometimes what happens is that, let's say within the same ethnicity, people tend to discriminate against people that has a different, color. What happens sometimes, for instance, I'm originally from Colombia, and the Pacific coast in Colombia, it's mainly of African descent. So these individuals, I mean, like 90% of these inhabitants in the Pacific coast in Colombia are direct descendants of African slaves, and they are, Black. And in Latin America, in many countries, we tend to have also people from European descent. There is a lot of mix, but there are also natives. And it's a little bit like here, but I have met also people who consider themselves white in their countries, like in a friend that I met from Peru, and he was considered white in his country, but when he moved in here, he had to use another color because he was not white enough. And that's what this protected class refers to, is when there is sometimes discrimination. A Colombian person may discriminate against another Colombian or another Latin American because they're not white, or because they just have a different color. And that's what we protect under this when we file the fair housing discrimination complaints based on color. Familial status is also to protect basically minors. I investigated a fair housing discrimination complaint based on familial status. When we do the investigation, basically what we are required to do is to understand what happened. When I talk to a complainant and the complainant says, well, I was discriminated against, and this is the reason why, I don't have any reason not to believe that person for what he or she is telling me. But then when I ask the question to the respondent, and if the respondent says, no, I didn't discriminate against that person, then that's why during the investigation, we have to gather as much information as possible to understand exactly what happened. So we ask the complainant to provide documents, recordings, photographs, or evidence to support their allegation that they were discriminated against. And we ask the respondent for a non-discriminatory legitimate business reason. Also, if they say, no, we didn't discriminate against that person, we want to know, if they're treating everybody the same way. That's what we do in the investigation. We try to find out if they are applying their policies in the same way, being consistent with everybody. If they single out someone because of any of these protected classes, that's when we believe that maybe discrimination actually took place. So like I investigated 2 cases on familial status. One of them was this lady came to our office and she said, well, I think I was discriminated against. I went to this place. I loved the where it was located. It was perfect, the schools and everything. And when I applied, they told me, no, we cannot rent to you because you have children. And that's discriminatory. That's a discriminatory statement. That's, in its face is discrimination. So she filed a complaint. She said, I cannot live there because I have children. And then we investigated, we started the investigation. When we started the investigation, we asked the complainant to sign some forms. We send that along with a letter of notification, and we also send the interrogatories to ask, what happened. And then in the allegation, of course, it says that you told this woman that you wouldn't rent to her because she had children, and that's discriminatory. What happened? And this complex provided the response to the interrogatories, and they gave us what is called a non-discriminatory legitimate business reason. What happened was that this apartment complex was a 55+ community, and they had this permit saying we are a 55+ community, and therefore, no, we don't have children living here. And that was what we call a no-cause case, because they had this reason not to accept, families living there because they were a 55+ community, meaning that the residents there were older. But we had another case where this lady was fighting custody of her children from her previous marriage, and she had children with her new marriage. And then literally overnight, she got a letter from the court saying that now she had custody of her other children. So she went from having 2 children to having 5 children. So she actually asked the respondent, the apartment complex, to be moved to another unit. And she said, I had 2 children, now I have 5, I need a bigger apartment. And actually, I think we got an email from the respondent saying, well, you have too many children. Nobody's going to rent to you in Charlotte because you have too many children. That's a discriminatory statement. And during the process, which is another thing that we do, is we offer conciliation. We try to make sure that we give both parties the opportunity to talk what happened, to talk about it. And if they have an agreement, if they say, okay, let's forget about this case, what do you want? We ask the complainant for a request for relief, and then we ask we kind of help in the process of trying to find an agreement. And if both parties agree on something, then we conciliate the case, and then we close the case with HUD saying without a finding of fact. That's how it's called, meaning that we provided this opportunity to both parties, that they agreed on conciliating, and that we signed a negotiated settlement agreement, and then we close the case. That's part of what we also do during the investigation, trying to make sure that both parties have this opportunity to solve the problem. And we cannot tell the complainant what to ask for. Sometimes the complainant offers the request for relief, but sometimes also the respondent, if it's an apartment complex, they may say, well, maybe this was a mistake, we didn't mean to do this, but we can offer, a free month of rent, or we can let that person go if she needs to break the lease or something like that. So if there is an agreement and both parties are signed the negotiated settlement agreement, then we close the case. And that's what happened with this lady who got that email saying that she had too many children. And I guess when that is exposed in a way, then it's I would say easier to conciliate the case, and that's what happened. Disability would require a presentation in itself, because disability has, actually is one of the main reasons why we are investigating for housing discrimination complaints. And there are 2 issues, two main issues with disability, and these are the accommodations and the modifications. So when an individual who has a disability makes a request to a housing provider because of their disability, they're asking, it may have a physical or visible disability, or it may be a mental disability. We have actually a lot of complaints where the individual or the tenant has a mental disability and they need an emotional support animal, which is a big issue in apartment complexes. So when this tenant has this need for an emotional support animal, that emotional support animal is not a pet. It is a service, or it provides a service, an emotion support for this tenant. So when there is an accommodation request, in this case, is to allow that animal to live with the tenant, and then sometimes that's when the landlords ask for pet fees, or they reject the tenant, or they ask the tenant to leave when they realize that there is an animal living in the apartment or the unit, and then that's when we investigate. So what happened? And the complainant says, well, I had this emotional support animal, I provided my documentation, the doctor said that I had the right to have my emotional support animal living with me, but the respondent is saying, forget it. We do not allow pets to live here, or animals live here. So when we investigate the complaints, that's what we want to understand, that there is a connection between that emotional support animal or that animal and the disability and the request. Basically, the request has a connection with the disability. Sometimes it's a modification, which is the other key word there, because the individual, the tenant, for instance, has a physical disability and he or she needs a ramp. So if it's possible, which is the other issue with disability, is the word reasonable. If it's reasonable, then it should be possible for the landlord to allow the tenant do whatever he or she needs in order to have a normal life in that housing solution, in that apartment, that house, or whatever is it that they're living. So if there is a need for a ramp, for instance, then if it's reasonable and the tenant can pay for those expenses, and supposedly the landlord should allow that person to have the ramp. If the complainant or the tenant says, I want an elevator to my third floor because I want to live there, I don't want to live in the first floor, and I need an elevator, that's an unreasonable modification request, or when it becomes a burden, they have to change their procedures. When it's unreasonable, then when we do the investigation, we can find out that really is not possible to provide that accommodation or modification request, and then it may be a no-cost case. That's why it is so important for us to do the investigation, because we need to make sure that we have as much information as possible to understand what happens. And our next is sex. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because we, as I said earlier, we have a presentation dedicated specifically about the new guidance from HUD and from the government around this. So that's going to be the invitation, so you can stay with us for the rest of the presentation in the afternoon. And we have Teresa scheduled to finish in 6 minutes, I guess. Can we take like a break before we continue with our next guest, or?
Sure, that sounds good.
So
We'll
I guess
take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, let's take a 5 minutes break. I think this is my last slide, right?
Yes.
And then we can have a 5 minutes break, and then at 11 sharp, I will introduce our next guest, our next presenter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll restart in a minute. So, waiting for Teresa to start. Okay, everybody, it's 11 o'clock. Again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate in these presentations. I don't know if we actually mentioned that we are commemorating Fair Housing Month, which is in April. The Fair Housing Month, or the Fair Housing Law was signed in 1968 in April after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So every April, every year we commemorate Fair Housing Month. And again, because that was the month where when it was signed as a law. So as I mentioned earlier, we are going to focus on new guidance from HUD, from the government regarding a protected class, which is sex. And we have, let's say, two portions of this presentation divided in, we're going to talk about the situation right now here in Mecklenburg. We have our next presenter is Cameron Pruitt. Cameron is a dedicated facilitator with experience in human resources, youth ministry, and LGBTQ plus activism, including in his current role as president of the LGBTQIA plus Democrats of Mecklenburg County. His work has equipped him to advocate for equitable spaces in religious, political, and corporate settings, and he currently works as an instructor of youth mental health first aid, helping to break stigma and empower adults to aid youth in crisis. Again, Cameron is president of the LGBTQ Democrats of Mecklenburg County, and I want to say hello to Cameron and thank you very much. And Cameron, I think you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Luis and Teresa, and thank you all so much for being here today. I know I am right before the lunch break, so I will be very cognizant of time. And I just want to again thank you all for being here and taking time today to engage with this issue. I know that it is an evolving one and that there's some complexity here today, and I just want to thank you for taking this step, that what you're doing is so important, it impacts people's lives, and I hope today that you learned a little bit. Like I said, my name is Cameron Pruitt. I use he, him pronouns. And if you have any questions around sexual orientation and gender identity, I want to let you know that this is a safe space for us to learn together. So I have heard it all the questions and all the words and all the language, which still evolves and changes all the time. There's so much fluidity around identity and how we talk about a lot of those protected classes, whether that's race or disability, right? And so the same is true for gender identity and sexual orientation. So if you're confused about a term or you want me to expound on that, I will be happy to do so. And also know that when we're learning together, sometimes we make mistakes or we don't know what to say. And so I am here to answer any of those questions for you today as well. If we can head to the next slide. Back one, yeah, there we go. So LGBT, so today we're talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. Sexual orientation, very simply, is who people are attracted to innately. And so this is the LGB side of the conversation. And so L stands for lesbian, which is generally understood as women attracted to other women. G stands for gay, which is kind of a broad term. for someone who's attracted to someone else of the same sex. Often it's used to describe men who are attracted to other men. And B is bisexual, so someone who's attracted to people of either gender. Again, as the language evolves, you may also hear the term pansexual to talk about someone who is attracted to men and women or neither of those. And so, we have this sexual orientation piece. It's important for me to say here, much like a lot of our other categories, that sometimes this is an invisible protected class. You don't know just by looking at someone what their sexual orientation is. And so it's important to keep that in mind for when you are structuring your policies and looking at how you review potential applicants to rent or buy property from you or to be admitted into a shelter. And so that this class may not always be visible, or some people we may assume have a certain sexual orientation don't, or vice versa. And so it is true that LGBT individuals and families often meet upfront hostility from landlords, real estate agents, and lenders when looking at housing. Rhea Carey, who's the executive director for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, actually testified before Congress and said they may experience outright hostility and may be subjected to violence or property damage. So there is real discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation. That can look like a lot of different things. And I know that later on, Legal Aid of North Carolina will give you some specific cases and studies that have been conducted to talk about what some of those examples might be. But this is real. LGBT people are experiencing discrimination. And I actually am looking for an apartment right now, and I actually did 2 applications yesterday for apartments here in Charlotte. And so even when I am looking for an apartment, I ponder, to talk about whether or not I mentioned that I'm with my partner of 3 years and we're looking to move in together, because you don't always know what the reaction is going to be. And the reason I moved to Charlotte from South Carolina was I was looking for a more welcoming place to live. So, there are real tensions here for LGBT people. Let's move to the next slide. So gender identity, and we're going to spend a lot of time today, and a lot of my focus is going to be around gender identity. This is the T part of LGBT, transgender people. And so they exist, right? They exist all over the country. They exist in our schools and in our apartments and in houses, and they exist. And part of the reason that protections are needed is because these people are feeling excluded, are being systematically kept out and lacking access. And so like we saw in the earlier video about segregated by design, a lot of times policies, sometimes they're designed this way and sometimes their impact happens to be this way because of our blind spots of not seeing where transgender people are. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that today. So at birth on your birth certificate, you are born and on the birth certificate, they write male or female. That's it, right? And so, that child obviously has no idea of any parts of their identity, right? They have made no decisions about who they are. They have not grown into themselves, but on the birth certificate, it says one marker, and that stays with them for life. And so transgender people don't identify with the gender that's on their birth certificates. They were assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, and they identify as a different gender. And so transgender man on birth certificate may have said woman, right? But feels comfortable and feels internally that they are more comfortable with a different gender than the one that they were assigned with at birth. And so that's sort of the basic foundation of gender identity. Now, there are people who identify as male and female. There are people who are in between and don't really feel comfortable either way, and they identify as non-binary. And part of this, too, is just to say that there's a lot about gender that's very fluid, right? Our expectations of what stereotypes should be expected of men and women has changed dramatically, even over the past 10, 15, 20 years. One of the foundational legal cases that Legal Aid is going to talk about later also talks about sex stereotyping, right? That sex discrimination also includes in the workplace, if you're a woman and you are expected to behave a certain way because you are a woman, that's also stereotyping and sex discrimination. And so these stereotypes around what we have for gender and presentation and identity are part of the reason that we have these protections in place. And so in 2011, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and the National Center for Transgender Equality did a study of over 6,400 participants. And they found that 19% of transgender individuals had been denied a home or apartment, 19% had experienced homelessness, and 11% had been evicted due in part to their gender identity. And so this is a real issue, and these are why these protections we're excited about on behalf of the LGBT+ community, and hope that we can help engage you in ways to make your spaces more welcoming and inclusive. Let's move on to the next slide. So Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, how many LGBTQ+ people are? So you're going to see on a lot of the information today comes from surveys and self-reports of LGBT people. If you work with federal housing dollars, state housing dollars, you are aware of the importance and power of the census, right? Charlotte's elections have been turned over because census data is delayed. It is how we determine so much of our policy. The census does not track LGBT+ people. Most recently, in the latest census, there's an indirect way where if you are a same-sex person, if you are a person living with your partner who happens to be of the same sex, then the census counts you as LGBTQ. But that's it. And so if you are an LGBTQ+ person living alone, you are not counted as LGBTQ for the census. So we are working on estimates and surveys because that's the best data we have still for our government and official data collection. Gallup estimates, though, that there are over 125,000 LGBTQ+ adults in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. So a very large population, a large group of people. So you already have LGBTQ+ tenants or people or residents that you are servicing where you are. And so I think it's important to keep in mind is that these people may already be living in properties that you manage or own, or in shelters that you're running. And so, it's important to think about, how can we make our spaces inclusive for people we already have and people we will have in the future. As I said before, we have examples of discrimination. And so these protections matter, and the spaces and policies you're building can be life-saving for people. We know that even experiencing temporary homeless can have lifelong impacts for mental health, physical well-being. And so just taking steps now, again, to prevent discrimination, even, discrimination that was unintended or you were unaware. And so, that's why we want these protections in place and hope that we can find ways to work with you to make this process easier for you and so that you can engage with LGBTQ+ people in the future. And just as a side note, moving beyond just the legal compliance to making welcoming spaces, over 125,000 people in the Charlotte metro area, we network, right? As do a lot of groups, right? I know which parts of town are, by reputation, more LGBTQ+ friendly. When I'm looking at apartments, I ask other LGBTQ+ people where they live, what their experiences have been. So when you are engaging with LGBTQ+ customers, just like you would with other groups, you will find that they network, right? And so, when you reach one, then you reach several others. We've seen, especially in the past few years, talking about Pride Month and rainbows showing up everywhere. Part of that is because that community can be reached and connected to. And LGBTQ+ people exist everywhere, right? We exist throughout every socioeconomic status. Some of us are parents. We are in all races. We are in all industries. So we exist throughout the region, throughout spaces. And so wherever you find yourself recruiting or advertising, there are LGBTQ+ people in that space. And so making sure that you are connecting with them will also bring added benefit to your locations and to your business at the end of the day. And so moving beyond just simple compliance. A couple of just sort of small ways that you can make that happen is that I filled out 2 applications for apartments yesterday. One of them asked my marital status, for example. And so I had to put that I was single. There was no partner adoption, even though I've been with my partner for 3 years. We share a bank account, we share property. There was no space for me to say that on that one. The other application just asked relationship status and left a box for me to fill in. Another way to think about this too in your applications, because a lot of people are engaging with us digitally, right? Even more so right now, is to think about where you ask for gender, or if you ask for someone's preferred pronouns or what preferred name they may have. In North Carolina, right, it can be difficult to change your legal name, to change your gender, to match your gender identity, to change those legal documents. And so you may need that legal information but how can you also make space for someone who has a different preferred name than that's the one that's on their driver's license? So having a preferred name, a preferred pronouns box are ways to point that you're thinking through this and that you are trying to be more inclusive and aware of the person who's going to live in the property that you manage or own. And so, when someone wants to choose a place to live, they want to know that they're going to be safe. They want to know that they're going to be welcomed. And so just thinking through some of those things, moving beyond that just legal compliance and to try and find welcoming spaces to also help your business, right? And the top right photo here is from the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And again, this is just from LGBTQ owned businesses, right? So this is even just the purchasing power of LGBT people. That big top number there is $1.7 trillion in economic impact from LGBTQ owned businesses. They have over $917 billion of buying power in the United States. And those are just the businesses that LGBTQ plus people own. And so the community has a much larger buying power. And so, tapping into that resource to also help your business is just an added benefit. At the bottom, like I said before, LGBTQ plus people are looking for the same things that everyone else is looking for in housing. They're very mindful of feeling safe in their neighborhoods and their communities. Again, there's still a lot of violence against LGBTQ plus people in this country, especially against transgender people. Black transgender women actually have one of the highest rates of violence of any group in the United States. A Black trans woman was killed in Charlotte within the past week. And so being aware of that safety, not just, is this community welcoming? Is this going to be safe for people like me? And so being aware of that, right? Low violent crime rate, right? Low petty crime rate. Those are things people are looking for everywhere they want to move. And then just that they are protected, right? Not just that they feel safe, but that there are legal protections in place are a lot of things that people are looking for when they're looking for new homes, or especially if they're moving cities and relocating. And so again, LGBTQ plus people are looking for the same thing as everyone else. They want to feel safe. They want to be protected, especially in the places where we live and sleep and raise our families. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to consider as sort of next steps. Obviously, say we have our legal compliance after this part of the presentation, is to think about the other protected classes and how that would affect LGBTQ plus people. Like I said, sexual orientation and gender identity, you're not always going to be able to tell just by looking at someone that they are trans or that they are gay or that they are bi. And also to think about what might be the additional impacts of other factors, right? So one of the most at-risk groups include people, the elderly and the youth, right? When we talk about housing in general. And so LGBTQ plus people have added barriers when they're looking at those things. 34% of LGBTQ plus seniors worry about having to hide their identity just to get access to senior housing and living facilities. LGBTQ plus elders are twice as likely to live alone. They're 4 times as less likely to have children. And because of that, right, they're higher at risk. They have less of a familial safety net, and they may feel like they have fewer options to find places to live. And so that's why it's important to build these protected spaces for seniors who are at the end of their lives and have fewer connections, then find themselves with fewer options, and then find themselves in crisis. The same is true for LGBTQ plus youth. The Trevor Project estimates that almost 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ plus. And so that's for a variety of reasons. A lot of those are familial connections, or maybe not being able to find safe spaces in foster homes. And so, thinking about these parts of the life, where we have the youth and the elders, are also just things to be aware of when we are talking about how these protections can actually be life-saving for all LGBTQ plus people and for all protected groups, that we are building more inclusive spaces which will be safer for everybody. So a couple of things that I encourage you to do as next steps. I know that diversity, equity, inclusion training is definitely the hot topic right now and the buzzword of the HR world, but I do think it is beneficial to also look at your staff and yourself of ways that you can broaden your understanding, engage your own implicit biases and judgments. We all come with bias. I think they talked about a little bit earlier with the CRC's part of the presentation of talking about what prejudice that I hold within me. And so engaging with your own prejudice, engaging with your own implicit biases is incredibly important. There's a 2007 study that came out of Michigan about same-sex couples, and they were doing test housing, testing to see what the results were. And same-sex couples were shown fewer apartments. They were given higher rates of deposit and fees to pay. And so finding where your implicit biases lie is just as important to make sure that we are not causing any disparate impact or treatment of people. And so engaging with that DEI training for yourself, for your employees, for your staff, to be able to build those inclusive spaces within your work environment, to also then build out into your living spaces and your residences. So I just have a couple of resources on there. Action United Collaborative is a local Charlotte-based group that does DEI training. The Community Relations Committee offers trainings just like this one. And then Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, which is engaged with a lot of our local legal professionals, district court judges, but also focuses on some of those implicit bias steps and talks about gender identity and sexual orientation as well. The other thing is that there are a lot of LGBTQ plus organizations in Charlotte who would love to get connected with you, ways to engage with the community, with business, to help out kids. And so I've given just 3 of them. Charlotte Pride is the largest parade, or at least was in 2019, the largest parade and event Charlotte holds throughout the entire year. They do events all year long. You probably have at least heard or seen parts of Charlotte Pride happen before, but they are always looking for ways to engage. And maybe you can even find ways to recognize, Charlotte Pride event at your spaces during the time when people are coming into town. Charlotte LGBT Chamber of Commerce is one of the largest LGBT chambers in our entire region. They have over 300 LGBTQ plus owned small businesses. They have partners, corporate partners, strategic partners. They offer trainings and certifications and ways for you to network with other businesses. So if you're also looking for other LGBTQ plus businesses to network with, or ways to find more training about how your business can better be in compliance with sexual orientation and gender identity protections, or just what other LGBTQ companies are doing, the Chamber is a fantastic resource here in Charlotte. And then finally, Time Out Youth. So Time Out Youth is a nonprofit that works with LGBTQ plus youth. As I said, unfortunately, nearly 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ plus. And so Time Out Youth is a resource that caters to youth who may be experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. They cater to youth who may be struggling with their gender identity and just figuring out who they are, right? The stress of being a teenager is already high enough, and then potentially to be facing discrimination or judgment as you figure out these questions. And so Time Out Youth has been a phenomenal resource for years in the community, helping kids of all backgrounds to engage. And even in the pandemic, they've been doing like virtual gaming groups. And so they're also a great charity and resource to connect with and have lots of volunteer opportunities for you. So those are just a couple of the resources and next steps I would encourage you to take. Next up, I do have a video that we'll show before we get to our break. But I do just want to say that, again, if you have any questions, I've got a ton of links there on the slides, but I would be happy to answer them either here before the break, or I'll be here through the end of the day as well with Legal Aid's presentation. Again, thank you so much for what you're doing. These 2 videos are kind of a back-to-back splice. One is from SAGE, which works with elder LGBTQ plus people. Like I said, one of those at-risk groups that we want to help. And the other's Joe Biden last week talking to the National Center for Transgender Equality. As president, he signed an executive order, which kind of moved into what Housing and Urban Development's working on now. And I know Legal Aid will go through the timeline there of Supreme Court, executive order, HUD timeline, but it's President Biden speaking last week to the National Center for Transgender Equality. And we can go ahead and start that video.
Thank you so much, Cameron. If there are any issues with the video, please let me know. Oh, well, there might be one before I can even. So I swear I tested these. I really did. You would not be able to know. Oh my goodness.
Teresa, I can screen share. It's working on mine.
Okay, thank you so much.
I found a great one-bedroom apartment where I can age in peace.
I live in a two-bedroom home where I feel safe and comfortable.
I found a beautiful apartment for me and my fiance to live out our golden years.
I have been turned down for every apartment that I have applied for.
In my inaugural address, I said the American story depends not on one of us, not on some of us, but on all of us. So I'm proud to join you today to celebrate the courage of transgender individuals. As a nation, we have made significant progress in securing the civil rights of the LGBTQ plus Americans. But we recognize that too many transgender people still face systemic barriers to freedom and equality. Too many transgender Americans face violence, harassment, and discrimination in employment, healthcare, public accommodations, and housing. Nearly 1 in 3 transgender Americans has experienced homelessness at some time in their life. The crisis of violence against transgender women, especially transgender women of color, is a stain on our nation's conscience. And a survey last year found that more than half the trans and non-binary young people had considered suicide. What a painful, powerful reminder of how much work we have to do to help trans youth feel supported in living their lives, their authentic selves. And as we work to change the hearts and minds, we also have to change the laws. That's why on my first day in office, I signed an historic executive order directing federal agencies to build on the Supreme Court's Bostock ruling, protecting transgender Americans from discrimination. In the words of the order, every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love.
Again, just thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box. And I'll pass back over to Teresa and Louise.
Thank you so much, Cameron. And with that, we will go ahead and move to our lunch break. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, and that's, in my opinion, never a bad thing. So we'll have even more time for questions or for our presentation from Legal Aid and the Fair Housing Project to maybe even dive a little bit deeper. So if you all want to go ahead and take a break, and we will meet you back here at around noon. That will be great. So thank you so much, and we will see you shortly. Alrighty, I think it's about that time. I hope everyone has returned from lunch. I hope you enjoyed your 30-minute break. I want to go ahead and introduce Jeff Dillman and Lauren Brazil. Jeffrey Dillman is the managing attorney and co-director of the Fair Housing Project at Legal Aid of North Carolina. From 2005 to 2011, he was the executive director of the Housing Research and Advocacy Center, which is a nonprofit fair housing organization in Cleveland, Ohio. Previously, he was an associate professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, where he taught and supervised students in the civil and immigration law clinics from 2002 until 2005. He has also taught in the clinical program at the University of Dayton School of Law and was a supervising attorney for the Asylum and Refugee Law Project at the University of Michigan School of Law. For 6 years, Mr. Dillman was in private practice in Michigan with a practice focusing on prison civil rights litigation. He is licensed to practice law in the state of North Carolina. I also would like to introduce Lauren Brazil. She is a staff attorney with the Fair Housing Project of Legal Aid of North Carolina. She represents victims of housing discrimination in state and federal courts, as well as in fair housing administrative hearings. She has presented at numerous fair housing training sessions for housing consumers, advocates, attorneys, and housing providers. And she is also licensed to practice law in North Carolina and earned her undergraduate degree at, I apologize, I might mess up the way that I'm pronouncing this, Lauren, Lay University, and she received her JD at Temple University School of Law. So without any further ado, please take it away, Jeff and Lauren. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you very much, Teresa. And thank you for inviting us to present at the conference. It's been a great morning, and we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with folks. And we're hoping that this will lead to a dialogue, and we're going to try to keep a bunch of time for questions at the end. I've been looking at the chat, and there have been a number of questions that have come in, and some have already been discussed among the presenters. Cameron, I see, has answered a few, but I would really encourage people, if they do have questions, to please make sure you put those in the chat. And then we can also, I believe, unmute people at the end and have a discussion, because we really want this to be as educational for folks as possible, not only on the topics that we're specifically addressing today around LGBTQ discrimination, but around the Fair Housing Act more generally during April, which is Fair Housing Month. I do want to give one little disclaimer at the beginning, which is that both Lauren and I are attorneys, as Teresa mentioned, but this presentation is not legal advice. So this is for information purposes only, and so we can't tell you exactly how to handle a situation, give you legal advice about what to do. If you do have questions, you're more than welcome to contact the Fair Housing Project, and we can see if you're eligible for services and then potentially provide advice and assistance that way. But today's presentation is just for informational purposes only. And for those of you who don't know Legal Aid, we're a nonprofit law firm, and so we represent low-income individuals throughout the state of North Carolina. And you can go one more slide, Teresa, if you want. In civil matters, and we have offices in over 20 cities across the state, including in Charlotte, in Concord, and in Gastonia, in that part of the state, but also in other major cities and a number of smaller towns throughout North Carolina. And we represent people in a lot of housing work. A lot of that is around eviction defense or foreclosure defense, but we also help people with public benefits. We help victims of domestic violence. We do work around veterans and seniors. So we have a number of different areas where we work, and the Fair Housing Project is one of our specialized projects at Legal Aid. And we specifically, in the Fair Housing Project, deal with housing discrimination. And we do that by representing individuals who experience discrimination, by conducting trainings for the general public or for housing providers or housing seekers, tenants and home buyers, for local governments as well. And then we also do fair housing testing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the presentation. But again, thank you all for inviting us here today. And this is just an agenda, and I believe you're going to be getting a copy of this presentation at the end. And this is sort of the outline of what Lauren and I are going to be talking about. And I'm going to talk about the first few topics there, sort of a little bit about the history and the context of discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces, and then talk about how the law has really developed with regard to anti-LGBTQ discrimination. And then Lauren is going to talk about some of the more recent developments with President Biden's order that Cameron mentioned briefly earlier, and some local laws, and then some specific applications of these provisions in the law. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So before we get into the provisions of anti-discrimination with regard to the LGBTQ communities, I just wanted to sort of emphasize what the Fair Housing Act applies to. And the Fair Housing Act was written to apply to what are called dwellings. So it's not all property, but it's places where people live. It includes things that you would normally think about, like a house or an apartment or a condominium, but it also includes certain other types of group housing. So group homes where you might have, it could be for people with developmental disabilities or physical disabilities or recovering substance abusers. Shelters, most homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters are covered by the Fair Housing Act. Migrant housing, assisted living, where people are staying for a long period of time, and what's called long-term transient lodging. So it doesn't cover a situation where someone's renting a hotel or a motel room for a weekend or even a couple of weeks. But if someone is staying at a particular location and has an expectation of returning there over an extended period of time, then the Fair Housing Act is going to apply to that property. And this would with a few very minor exceptions that I'm not going to get into right now unless there's some questions that people have, this means that all of the provisions that were discussed earlier this morning by Luis and Teresa, and that were in the film, as well as by Cameron, apply. So discrimination based on those 7 federally protected groups of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. So in all of these types of housing, all these types of dwellings, discrimination would be prohibited. And if we can go to the next slide, the law is also very broad in terms of who has to comply with the act. So it's virtually anyone who's involved in the selling or renting of the property or managing of it, but also even at times somewhat broader than that. And so in a rental situation, the law must be complied with not only by the owner or the landlord, some people refer to the person, by the management company, the manager, other employees, even maintenance workers and groundskeepers, people like that. When you have housing that's owned or managed by a housing authority or some other nonprofit, that entity is also bound by the Fair Housing Act. And so the housing authority and its employees can't discriminate, or if it's a nonprofit that's running a Section 8 voucher program, they would not be allowed to discriminate. In the sales context, it's almost anyone involved in the sales transaction. So everyone from the agent and the company they work for, to the lender, the employees of the lender, the loan officers, even the homeowner's insurance company is prohibited from discriminating. And then 2 other areas that I think sometimes people overlook is homeowners associations and condo boards must comply with the Fair Housing Act as well. And we've had some cases against these entities because a lot of times the boards that are managing or overseeing the associations are focused on issues around aesthetics. They're making sure that people are painting their home the right color or putting up the right style of fence or not putting up any fence, if that's what the homeowners association rules say. And they don't realize that they might have to follow fair housing laws. And that also applies to, not only just to not discriminating based on race or sex or some of these other grounds, but also sometimes accommodating people with disabilities. And that's one area where we've seen some particular problems with homeowners associations and condo boards, is not understanding their obligations. And then finally, I'll sort of briefly mention this, and Lauren will get into it a bit more later, is that neighbors and other third parties are sometimes required to comply with the law. And that particularly becomes the case when there's issues of harassment of a tenant. So a tenant might have a claim not only against an owner or a manager who was harassing that tenant based on a protected class, based on their sex or their race or their national origin. But if a neighbor is doing it, there sometimes is a right of the person to bring a case, not only against the neighbor, but also against the manager if they didn't take action against that. So I'm going to turn now to a little bit of the context of discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces. And there have been a number of studies over really the past 20 years that have looked at discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in housing. And there's sort of two main ways that that people have looked at this. One is simply asking people, right, doing a survey. And so this first report here is a survey that was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they just asked individuals, have you experienced housing discrimination? Do you know someone else in your community who has experienced housing discrimination? And so back in 2001, 11% of lesbian and gay respondents reported themselves having experienced housing discrimination, and actually 35% reported knowing someone else who had experienced such discrimination based on their sexual orientation. But we know from the work that we do, and I assume if we stop to think about it, it in some ways seems a little bit obvious, but people who experience discrimination or people who suffer discrimination, who are discriminated against, don't always know when they have experienced that discrimination. In the past, in the 60s and earlier, when people discriminated based on race, they were very open about it. There would be signs that said whites only, no Mexicans, limiting people based on their race, their national origin, their religion. And these were signs, they were advertisements, they were statements. I'm not going to rent to your kind. We don't want you around here. It was very open and blatant. But in the last 40 or 50 years, most types of housing discrimination have become much more subtle. And so you very, very rarely see ads or statements or signs indicating those types of blatant types of discrimination anymore. Instead, you see what people often refer to as discrimination with a handshake and a smile, where someone is told, oh, I'm sorry, we just rented that unit. It's no longer available. And, or they're quoted a price that's higher than someone in another group. Or someone may not be told about a special that is being offered to members of one particular racial or other protected class. And we've seen at the Fair Housing Project, we do fair housing testing, I mentioned earlier, and we will send out someone who is white and someone who is Black to the same apartment complex and see how they're treated. And there are times when our white tester is told about several units and our Black tester may be told nothing is available or only told about one of those. Or our white tester is told about a special that's being offered and the Latino is not mentioned. They don't tell that person about the special. And so in order to uncover discrimination, currently, you sometimes need to do what's called fair housing testing, where trained individuals are sent out and they approach a housing provider and see how they're treated. And so in the area of discrimination based on sexual orientation in particular, there have been a number of studies that have been done. And so this Michigan report from 2007 is an example of that. And actually Cameron mentioned this this morning as well. And so in this study, they did 120 tests each test had two people, a matched pair. So there was one person who was in a same-sex couple and one person who was in a opposite-sex couple. And they tried to rent apartments. They approached landlords and property managers in a number of different cities in Michigan. And in over a quarter of the time, the lesbian or gay testers experienced unfavorable treatment. And at times they also, that unfavorable treatment included everything from not being told about units, being told higher prices. Sometimes slurs were made referencing people's sexual orientation. Derogatory comments were said in a number of instances. And so this type of testing is very important because it uncovers something that an individual may not understand or may not detect if they were just to approach a housing provider by themselves. If we go to the next slide, in 2013, HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, back one, I think you went to there, thank you, did an even broader sample, and they did internet-based testing. And this was actually HUD's, I think it was their first time using internet-based testing to conduct a widespread investigation of housing discrimination. And they found, they did 7,000 tests in 50 different areas across the country. And they found similarly that same-sex couples experienced more housing discrimination. In fact, the primary difference was that people who identified themselves in these emails as in a same-sex couple received fewer responses to their email inquiries. And that's very important because if you're not even getting a response, you have no opportunity. It just completely cuts off the search. And so someone can't go beyond that, right? They're not, if they're not even getting that first initial, like, oh, what are you interested in? Or here's what we have available, or here's how to come, take a look at the property. I didn't even receive a response. And so it was, it was actually not even noticeable whether it was different in different parts of the country. It was something that existed in virtually all of these 50 metropolitan areas that were studied. And in fact, in the HUD study, they didn't even see a big difference between cities that had protections for anti-discrimination laws in housing related to sexual orientation or gender identity, and states or localities that did not have those laws. So it was something that was existing throughout the country. The Equal Rights Center study, Cameron mentioned seniors, and we saw that video this morning from SAGE. And so the Equal Rights Center is an organization based in Washington, DC, and they did a study of senior housing. And they did in 10 different states, and they had individuals call, some who were indicating that they were in a same-sex relationship and some that were in an opposite-sex relationship. And they found that in almost half of the instances, the same-sex couple reported being treated differently, worse. Individual states range somewhat, but on the whole, it was just under half of the instances where there was discrimination. And the types of discrimination are what I've mentioned before in terms of higher fees that were quoted to the same-sex couples, higher rents, more onerous application processes. The opposite-sex couples, likewise, got benefits. They were given more information. They were told more about specials or other financial incentives. And one interesting thing that they also uncovered is that a number of couples, when they were asking for a one-bedroom apartment, that wasn't a problem for the opposite-sex couples. But for the same-sex couples, they were more often to be told that they, to be given information about a two-bedroom unit and not a one-bedroom unit, that the complex didn't want them to be sharing a bedroom, indicating that there was discrimination going on. And obviously, two-bedroom units are more expensive. Some couples may want a second bedroom. They may want to have a study or a guest room, but they shouldn't be required to have that. And if they're asking for a one bedroom, they should be treated the same, regardless of whether they're in a same-sex relationship or an opposite-sex relationship. So if we go to the next slide, there's also been some surveys of discrimination against transgender individuals. And so a study in 2015 found that almost a quarter of trans people surveyed reported experiencing some type of housing discrimination. And 70% of trans individuals who were in a shelter, homeless shelter, experienced discrimination and mistreatment. And sometimes the mistreatment was abuse. It could be physical abuse, it could be verbal abuse, but something even beyond just discrimination. And then the Williams Institute found similarly, they actually synthesized, they examined a wide number of studies about discrimination against transgender individuals and same-sex couples, and found that this type of discrimination existed in almost all of these types of examples that I've been giving throughout a wide variety of studies that have been done throughout the country. And then finally, I want to talk briefly, if we can go to the next slide, about the housing needs of homeless youth and in particular transgender individuals. And Cameron, I know, mentioned this a bit this morning, but there's a range of studies, and I think Cameron gave the number of 40%, and I think that that might be more up to date, but there have been a range of studies that have looked at the rates of transgender, of LGBTQ youth among homeless, and it's a disproportionate number. And we know that there's a wide variety of reasons why there is a high degree of homelessness, relatively high degree of homelessness among LGBTQ youth. There's issues of poverty, there's issues of abuse and neglect, there's people who are aging out of foster care. But there's also, on top of all of those, a rejection among some families of especially transgender youth, but also lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth as well. And so according to some studies, up to a quarter of LGBTQ youth are thrown out of their homes by their families, resulting in homelessness. And when individuals actually access housing through a shelter, there are actually high rates of discrimination. There are, according to this survey that was done, almost 30% were turned away from a shelter based on their status, or they were forced to stay in a shelter that was for the wrong gender. So a transgender man or young or boy was being forced to stay in a women's shelter, or a transgender woman was being forced to stay in a man's shelter. And then there was a high degree of harassment and assault that individuals experienced, not only by residents, but also by staff. And in fact, some of the research has pointed out that, given the high degrees of, or the relatively high degree or high number of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals who are homeless, people in the homeless community are not necessarily as surprised by that, but sometimes individuals experience more harassment or more assault from the staff at these shelters, right? So it's not just a matter of the staff sometimes talk about wanting to make sure that they're protecting people from other residents, but sometimes they need protecting from the staff of shelters. And so there's a lot of dangers that individuals face. And again, given the high rates of homelessness, this type of discrimination at a place where someone is supposed to find shelter, someone is supposed to find a relief from the homelessness, it is quite distressing. So this is sort of the context and the environment of housing and of types of discrimination that LGBTQ individuals face in the country. And so I'm going to turn now, if we can go ahead, to talk a little bit about what does the Fair Housing Act say with regard to discrimination. And when we talked this morning, or when Luis and Teresa talked this morning about the Fair Housing Act in general, the federal statute and North Carolina statute similarly do not explicitly provide protection for people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Right? The act has on the federal level, 7 protected classes, and sexual orientation and gender identity are not 2 of the ones that are listed, but the act does prohibit discrimination based on sex. In a number of other states around the country, in fact, over 21 states, I think there might be more right now, but they have specifically enacted legislation that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, sometimes gender expression as well. And a number of cities have done that around the country. But in North Carolina on a state level and the federal level, those aren't explicitly protected. And so the question is, well, how is sex defined in the federal statute? And as we're going to see, especially I'll go a little bit through the history, just to sort of so that people understand sort of how the law is developed. But currently, those categories, sexual orientation and gender identity, and this is the spoiler alert, I guess, are protected as a type of sex discrimination. And the history of this, if we can go to the next slide, actually comes out of employment discrimination cases, which is, some people might find a little bit strange. What does housing have to do with employment? But in our federal laws, employment is protected. Employment discrimination is covered by something called Title VII. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination in employment. So it says an employer can't refuse to hire someone because of their race or their color or a bunch of other grounds, as well as their sex. The Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, is actually Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act. And so the courts, when they're trying to interpret the Fair Housing Act, often look to Title VII, the employment discrimination cases, to see how the law is being interpreted in those situations to decide how it should be applied in a housing context. So in courts, and we'll see as we get to the Supreme Court decision that Cameron mentioned earlier, Bostick, when courts look to the history and interpreting these laws, they're really often looking to employment cases. And so a very important employment case back in 1989 looked at a woman who was trying to become partner at Price Waterhouse, which is a big company that does accounting and a number of other things. And she was denied her partnership. She had worked there for a number of years because they said she was too aggressive and she wasn't feminine enough. Okay. Now, these being aggressive for the male people who were coming up for partnership was an advantage. They wanted their male employees, to be aggressive, because that was considered, in line with their role, with their ideas of how a man should behave in accounting and in the consulting work that Price Waterhouse did. But when they had a female employee who was acting in the same manner, she was denied a promotion to partnership. And so when she filed a lawsuit against Price Waterhouse, the Supreme Court said that she was discriminated against based on sex under Title VII, because the company, Price Waterhouse, was discriminating in terms of whether she was complying or acting in conformity with gender stereotypes. The gender stereotype for a woman was to be feminine, to not be aggressive. And so because she was not acting in conformity with that, she was being actually discriminated against because of her sex, because it was a sex-based stereotype of how a woman should behave. And so that was really one of the first cases where the Supreme Court looked at the idea of, how do people behave, and how does that relate to someone's sex, and is that a type of sex-based discrimination? About a decade later, the Supreme Court issued a decision, actually by Justice Scalia wrote it, and it was a unanimous decision in which an individual claimed that he was being harassed. He was a man who was working, and saying he was being harassed by other men, and they were making comments based on implying what his sexual orientation was. And he said this was a type of sexual harassment that was prohibited by the employment discrimination laws, Title VII. And the Supreme Court agreed. They said that whether sex harassment is a man harassing a woman, or a woman harassing a man, or a man harassing a man, or a woman harassing a woman, no matter how it was, that could still be a type of sex harassment. And so what the court was doing here was trying to examine what does it mean to engage in sex discrimination or sexual harassment, which is a specific type of sex discrimination. And what does that definition mean? And saying that it isn't just how a man treats a woman, right? Or denying someone employment based solely on their gender, but it is something that's broader. So based on these two decisions. If we can go to the next slide. In 2010, HUD came out with a memo and said that sex discrimination, sort of following the Price Waterhouse case, includes nonconformity with traditional gender stereotypes. And so if a man is being treated differently because he doesn't act or dress what people would traditionally consider masculine enough, or a woman doesn't act or dress what's traditionally considered feminine enough, that is a type of sex discrimination. And that idea of sort of, how you're acting in relation to your gender stereotypes is very, very close to an idea of gender identity, right? Is their identity in line with what their sex is? So HUD back in 2010 issued this memo. It applies to all dwellings, public and private, all types of housing that I discussed earlier that are considered dwellings, although it wasn't explicit in saying that discrimination based on sexual orientation is unlawful. It was really just focusing on this idea of conformity or nonconformity with sexual stereotypes. And in fact, there was a case that the US Department of Justice brought in the mid, I don't know how we refer to this, the 20-teens, around 2015 or so, of an individual who was a tenant in a mobile home park who informed the property manager, this individual had moved in and identified as a man, and then came out and said that she was going to be identified as a woman and was going to be wearing women's clothing, and because of that was evicted from this mobile home park. And so this person, she brought a complaint against the mobile home park to HUD, and HUD found that was treating this person differently because the person was not acting in conformity with traditional gender stereotypes in line with the Price Waterhouse decision. And so actually a federal lawsuit was brought by the US Department of Justice against the owners of that mobile home park as a type of discrimination, sex-based discrimination. Subsequent to this, if we can go to the next slide, HUD issued some guidance, actually issued some rules that applied to any HUD-assisted or HUD-insured housing. And so this included public housing that's owned by housing authorities, but also shelters and other entities that get HUD funding, and lenders that make FHA loans. And HUD explicitly said that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity or marital status would be unlawful if someone was receiving this HUD money. And the public housing authorities have generally been fairly good about complying with this on the whole. I mean, there have been instances here and there. Shelters had I think some of them, particularly a number of homeless shelters, had a harder time understanding their obligations under this. And in particular, HUD issued some subsequent guidance that talked about, how do you house people, particularly in single-sex shelters. Private units, if someone has is in a shelter or is in other housing where they have their own bedroom and their own bathroom, sex discrimination is prohibited in that type of situation. But when you have housing where people are sharing living spaces, sharing a bedroom, maybe there's a communal room with a number of bunk beds, like in some situations in certain homeless shelters or even domestic violence shelters, or people are sharing a common bathroom. Those types of housing, HUD has always allowed them to be sex segregated. And so you can have a men's shelter or a women's shelter if you have that shared bathroom or shared sleeping space. And so HUD added clarifications over the years in 2016 to indicate that in a shelter that's HUD funded, people should be housed in a shelter that corresponds to their self-identified gender identity. So a transgender man should be housed in the men's shelter, a transgender woman in the women's shelter, and that housing providers, that shelter providers, shouldn't make decisions based on what they perceive or think someone's gender identity is, or believe it to be. They really should ask them, what gender do you identify with, and place them in that shelter. So HUD issued this guidance, and if we can turn to the next slide, importantly, HUD emphasized that religious organizations who operate a number of shelters in certain locations must also comply with these. The fact that a religious organization may have certain beliefs about sexual orientation or gender identity, doesn't preclude them from having to, or doesn't allow them to not comply with the law. And HUD had established the law for shelters that receive that kind of HUD funding, and saying that sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination is unlawful. And so required that shelters that do accept that money, actually comply with the law. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, great. And so now I'm going to talk about a couple of the more recent decisions that led up to the Supreme Court's important decision last year in the Bostic case. And the first, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the facts of these cases, because I think it's really important to understand what was going on and what individuals experience. That housing discrimination can be quite devastating in terms of emotionally for individuals, as well as the denial of housing itself from individuals. And so in the Smith case, which came out of Colorado, there was a same-sex couple, two women. One of the women was transgender, and they were looking for housing for themselves and their two children. And so they went around and they saw 2 units that were being offered by a landlord, and they asked to be able to rent one of them. And the response from the landlord shortly after the landlord had shown them to them is they said that given their unique relationship, the landlord didn't want to rent to them because it would be the focus of discussion in the town, and it would harm the landlord's position in the town. The landlord was going to be embarrassed about having rented to a lesbian couple, one of whom was transgender. And because of that, they were denied the opportunity to rent housing. And so this couple brought a lawsuit against the landlord, saying that it was a type of sex discrimination, that the landlord was discriminating based on sexual orientation, and that violated the Fair Housing Act. And the court agreed. The court said discrimination for failure to conform to gender stereotypes was unlawful, and discrimination based on sexual orientation was unlawful, both of them under the Fair Housing Act as a type of sex discrimination. And so this was taking what had been adopted in the employment context that I had mentioned earlier and explicitly applying it to housing. In the Wetzel case, this was a case in a retirement community, a senior living facility. And I mentioned earlier that study that was done of retirement communities, senior housing, finding nearly half of the instances where people experienced discrimination. Here, there was a woman who was a resident of this apartment complex, or this senior complex, the Glen St. Andrew Living Community, and she was lesbian, and she experienced vicious harassment and abuse by other residents there. There was physical abuse of her. She used a scooter. Her scooter was rammed by other people. They knocked, there was a communal dining room where residents ate all of their meals. Her table was knocked over. She was physically struck. She was spat upon in an elevator. And there was vicious verbal harassment of her over an extended period of time. And she complained to the owners. She said that she was being harassed. She said that she was being abused. And while initially there was a response by the owners to try to decrease it, the owners then ultimately did nothing. And the abuse and the harassment continued. And then the response was, well, they'll move her to another part of the dining room away from everyone, so that she was the problem. They told her to not use the common areas so that she wouldn't interact with individuals who were harassing her or abusing her. So she wasn't supposed to use those rooms except if she needed to get coffee in the common room, that she could go there, but otherwise she had to stay away from it. And so the actions that she experienced were quite extreme. And she filed a lawsuit against the provider. Not only, and the lawsuit alleged, again, violations of the Fair Housing Act for the complex knowing about this harassment and then failing to do anything about it. While they'd initially done something, they ultimately stopped doing anything, and the abuse and harassment continued for a time. So this case was initially dismissed by the court. The court said that that's not something, the lower court, that she could bring a lawsuit about. And then the Court of Appeals reinstated the lawsuit and said that what she had experienced was a type of sex-based discrimination based on her sexual orientation, and that she could bring this lawsuit against this retirement community based on a type of sex discrimination. So these were two important cases, and if we can go to the next slide, coming up to the sort of the larger decision and we're going back to employment in this case, but the Bostic decision in 2020. And so this was issued just this past June, and the case was actually a consolidation of a number of, there was 3 different cases. And in each of these cases, individuals who were either gay or transgender were discriminated against precisely because of their status. In one case, there was an individual, Mr. Bostic, who worked for the local county, Clayton County in Georgia, and he joined a gay recreational softball league and then was fired because of that. They said it was unbecoming conduct for a county employee to be in such a league. In another case, there was an individual who was fired also because he admitted that he was gay. And in the third case, an individual who actually worked for a funeral home was fired when she came out as transgender. And so in each of these cases, employers took action specifically because of an individual's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And then in all 3 cases, those individuals wound up filing lawsuits against their respective employers. And the Supreme Court wound up combining all of the cases together because they were dealing with very similar types of issues. And try to look at, what does the law say with regard to people who are lesbian or gay or transgender or bisexual in terms of sex discrimination. And so while we had other cases that addressed aspects of this, this was the first case that sort of explicitly asked this question: does this type of discrimination constitute a type of sex discrimination? Again, this was under Title VII, the employment law. And what the court said was yes. And there's a quote that I just want to read here briefly. It's just a sentence or 2 sentences, because I think it's very clear. It said, an individual's homosexuality or transgender status is not relevant to employment decisions. That's because it's impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex. And so the court was very clear, very emphatic that treating someone differently because of his or her sexual orientation, because of his or her gender identity, constitutes a type of sex discrimination that is unlawful. And it doesn't matter, the court said, whether that was what Congress thought when it passed Title VII in the 1960s, because that is how, to treat someone differently based on their status as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender is to treat them differently because of their sex. It's inherent in that type of action. And so that is unlawful in an employment context. And as I mentioned earlier, courts for 50 years have routinely applied Title VII decisions to Title VIII, which is the Fair Housing Act. And so when the court issued this decision in 2020, fair housing advocates felt pretty assured that when the case was brought up in a housing context, that this decision in Bostic was going to apply likewise to housing as well, and under the Fair Housing Act. So I'm going to turn it over right now to my colleague, Lauren Brazil, who's going to talk some more about some of the more recent developments around sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in housing. And then we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the 2021 updates to the sex discrimination, the definition of sex discrimination. So in January, President Biden issued Executive Order 13988, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. And it declared as policy that every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. And citing to the Bostock decision, found that the civil rights laws like Title VII and Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, that prohibit discrimination because of sex, includes the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Significantly, the executive order directed the heads of each federal agency to review all existing orders, regulations, guidance documents, memorandums, policies, programs, and other agency actions to ensure that they were in compliance with the executive order. Next slide. And so as a result of the executive order, HUD in February of 2021, next slide, issued a memorandum that was implementing the executive order. HUD was the first agency to issue their first piece of guidance in response to the executive order. And it was specific to the enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And the executive order was directed to HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which is responsible for investigating administrative fair housing cases, as well as to state and local governments who receive HUD funding to also investigate fair housing complaints. And what it said was that it recognized really that courts and governments have long withheld legal legitimacy from loving couples because of their sex, and have denied many persons the freedom to express a gender that defies norms. And it recognized that one of the most fundamental places where this occurs is housing, where we expect to be safe and free from discrimination, where we can live happily and with the freedom to love whom we choose and to express who we are. The memorandum also reviewed HUD's efforts, next slide, over the past decade to address discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which Jeff just reviewed dating back to the 2010 HUD memo, the equal access rules, the studies that they have done. And it recognized that, these efforts, although HUD had made steps towards in this direction, it was insufficient to meet the Fair Housing Act's purpose of providing fair housing throughout the United States, and that its actions thus far had been inconsistent with the Supreme Court's interpretation of sex discrimination under Bostock. And so as a result, next slide, HUD's Office of General Counsel concluded that the Fair Housing Act's sex discrimination provisions are comparable to those of Title VII, and which under Bostock had found that discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity constituted discrimination because of sex. And so it equally applied under the Fair Housing Act. The memorandum ordered effective immediately that HUD would investigate complaints of discrimination because of gender identity or sexual orientation as forms of sex discrimination. And it required local and state governments that receive HUD funding to comply with the memorandum and Bostock. And so there are the state and local agencies in North Carolina that receive funding from the Fair Housing Assistance Program include the North Carolina State Human Relations Commission, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Relations Committee, the Durham Human Relations Commission, Greensboro Human Rights Department, Orange County Human Relations Commission, and the Human Relations Commission in Winston-Salem. And HUD directed HUD, Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and these fair housing organizations to review all the complaints they had received as of the executive order for allegations of sex discrimination, to ensure that these complaints would be filed and investigated. There are, Jeff has talked a lot about just some examples of fair housing violations because of LGBTQ, but just some additional examples that I wanted to review today. So refusing to rent or sell a house to an LGBTQ individual is a form of sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Maybe the person affirmatively identifies, says I am gay, or I'm in a same-sex relationship, or they arrive at the property with their same-sex partner. They're applying for a 1-bedroom, and it's 2 individuals in a same-sex relationship. Would be forms of housing discrimination. It could be because the landlord perceives the individual or believes that they are an LGBTQ individual. It can also be a perceived transgender status, refusing to rent to an apartment to a gay or lesbian married couple while allowing heterosexual married couples to rent an apartment would be different treatment because of sex. Asking a transgender tenant whether they are disabled or why they receive SSI could be a form of sex discrimination. It could also be a form of disability discrimination. Sometimes we'll see allegations based on multiple protected classes. It really will depend on the facts of the case. Refusing to rent to a family because a member of the family's gender identity or expression. So maybe there is a child who has a different gender identity than their birth gender or their birth sex, excuse me, and that would be a violation. So some additional examples. A transgender woman is asked by the owner of her apartment building not to dress in women's clothing in the common areas of the property, would be a form of sex discrimination. A gay man is evicted because his landlord believes he will infect other tenants with HIV or AIDS. This again would be an example of sex discrimination as well as disability discrimination. An underwriter for an FHA insured lender is reviewing a loan application by 2 women. Both incomes are being used as the basis of the applicant's creditworthiness, and they meet all the requirements for the loan, but the underwriter assumes that the applicants are a lesbian couple and denies the application. That would be a form of sex discrimination. This could also equally happen in the rental application context. So those were the updates in 2021 on the federal level. North Carolina also had some local fair housing laws updated in 2021 to provide affirmative protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the cities of Durham and Greensboro amended their local fair housing laws to explicitly prohibit sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. And they also added protections in places of public accommodation and employment. And this really just brought their laws into compliance with federal law. Hillsborough, Carrboro, and Chapel Hill passed legislation prohibiting sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in public accommodation and employment. And Orange County passed similar legislation in public accommodation and public services. So those were the 2021 updates, primarily the HUD guidance in response to President Biden's executive order. But we also wanted to talk a little bit about harassment, and especially sex harassment in housing. Now, harassment can be based on any protected class, any federally protected class: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. But as Jeff described in the Wetzel case, a landlord can be held liable under the Fair Housing Act for failing to protect a tenant from known discrimination and discriminatory harassment by other tenants. And as he described the vicious discrimination that Ms. Wetzel suffered and the lack of response that the housing provider engaged in. HUD in 2016 issued a specific rule about harassment in housing. And it provided definitions and different forms of harassment. And then it also talked about standards for how we evaluate whether or not conduct constitutes any unlawful harassment. So the first form of discrimination or harassment under the HUD rule is what's called a hostile environment. So unwelcome conduct that is sufficiently severe or pervasive as to interfere with the availability or the rental or sale or use of a dwelling, the terms or privileges of the dwelling, or the availability of the dwelling. And so we see this in the Wetzel case, where Ms. Wetzel was repeatedly harassed by other tenants because of her sexual orientation. With the hostile environment, we look at the what's called the totality of the circumstances, the nature of the conduct, the context, the severity, the frequency, the duration, the location of the conduct, and the relationships to the other people involved. Now, it doesn't require physical harm, but the harm may be relevant to whether or not it's actionable and really relates to the amount of damages. And when you're looking at whether or not a particular circumstance rises to the level of a hostile environment, you're looking at it from the perspective of a reasonable person in that victim's position. The other form, next slide, of sex harassment is what's known as quid pro quo sex harassment. This for that. This a housing benefit in exchange for sex is one common type of sex harassment that we see. So it's an unwelcome request or demand to engage in conduct where submission to the request or demand is made conditioned to the sale or rental of a dwelling or the terms of the dwelling. And so where we see that is sex, so to avoid an eviction for non-payment of rent, the landlord or the maintenance or the manager requests that the tenant engages in sex. In the analysis of what is actionable, it is the landlord's demand or request for sex that is the violation of the law. And it doesn't matter if the tenant or the victim acquiesces to the unwelcome request. It's important to just keep in mind that harassment can be written, it can be verbal, it can be other physical conduct, although it doesn't require physical contact. And a single incident of harassment may be enough to rise to the level of a hostile environment or a quid pro quo harassment where it's sufficiently severe or it evidences this exchange of this or that. So those were the first two parts of HUD's 2016 harassment rule, talking about the two different types of harassment and the standards under which we evaluate to determine whether certain conduct rises to the level of harassment. The third part of the rule talked about really who is liable for discrimination. And so we know the person who engages in the discriminatory conduct is individually liable for their own discriminatory conduct. A person who supervises someone who engages in discrimination and fails to take action where they should have known of the discrimination is also liable under the fair housing laws for the discriminatory conduct. if a person knows of discrimination by a third party, so by a neighbor or another tenant, and fails to take action when they knew of the discrimination, they are liable, or they may be liable under the Fair Housing Act for the neighbor or the other tenant's discrimination. And that's what we saw in Ms. Wetzel's case, where Ms. Wetzel was being viciously harassed by the other tenants. She reported it to the landlord, and the landlord basically took no action, and actually took action against Ms. Wetzel by trying to segregate her and limit her access to the property in response to the allegations of harassment. Sometimes we'll see this where a victim of harassment complains to the landlord about a neighbor's harassment, and the landlord will turn around and evict the victim of the harassment. And that is, again, they're taking action against the victim instead of the perpetrator. Ultimately, the liability will depend on the level of control that that the landlord or property manager has. But in the context of a normal landlord-tenant relationship where it's tenant-on-tenant harassment, the landlord has a choice. They can take action against the perpetrator of the discrimination, or they can take action against the victim of the discrimination. And when the action is taken against the victim of the discrimination, they are more likely to be found liable because they could have equally taken the action against the harasser or the perpetrator. So what happens in a fair housing case once one has been filed? And if it's an administrative case and it's being investigated by HUD or the local fair housing agency, who enforces the fair housing laws? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the remedies and enforcement options. So there are a few different types of remedies available for victims of discrimination who file fair housing complaints. There's monetary damages, actual damages, compensatory damages, which is this large bucket that has a few different types of damages within it. So out-of-pocket expenses, and I will say that overall, the amount of monetary damages will really depend on the facts of each case. And they can really range, we see them all over the map, from several $1,000s to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Fair housing litigation can be very expensive for housing providers, which is why it is important to know the fair housing laws. So there's a few different categories, as I mentioned. So there's out-of-pocket expenses, which are usually the smallest part of fair housing awards. So if there was a lost, like a social security deposit, or somebody needed to pay for some storage fees because they weren't able to move into a property because of discrimination, they may be able to recover for these out-of-pocket expenses. But again, these are usually fairly small, a small portion of an overall Fair Housing Act claim award. The other, another type of damages recognized under the Fair Housing Act is what is known as lost housing opportunity damages. And these are damages when the housing from which a person was denied had a location or amenities or some other characteristic that made it particularly valuable to the individual applicant. So it could be the size or the configuration of the home. Maybe there was an extra office space that the person really needed, or a workspace, or a basement, or a playroom. It could be the location, right? We always hear real estate agents say, location, location, location. So maybe the home was near a particular school or in a certain school district. Maybe the children could walk to school, and this was a huge benefit for the family. Maybe it's near other family members, or a grocery store, medical providers, doctors, hospitals, near restaurants, or just other amenities that made it particularly desirable. The type of damages that are awarded or that denial is what's caused lost housing opportunity. The home itself could also be particularly desirable. Maybe there's a yard or a fence, or the pool or the gym facilities on the property make it particularly desirable for the individual. It's important, and we talk about these different factors. They can be hard to quantify, but again, not altogether that impossible, because we can look at the rents that are charged in these areas, and where a person was forced to rent after losing out on this property, and the difference of rent could be one way to calculate and measure the lost housing opportunities. There's actually many reported cases where we know the amounts of damages that are awarded for these types of cases that we can use as a guide when we're evaluating the lost housing opportunity. Another form of damages under the Fair Housing Act is emotional distress damages. And these are damages for the emotional distress caused by the discrimination, the stress, the anxiety, humiliation, embarrassment, anger, sadness. And it's important to know that courts have long recognized the emotional distress inherent in housing discrimination. And emotional distress damages are usually the largest part of a damages award in fair housing cases. Medical evidence, testimony, treatment is not required to establish emotional distress damages under the Fair Housing Act. All that is required would be from it can be shown through the testimony of the individual, but it can also just be inferred from the circumstances themselves. If there is medical documentation, then generally the award would be higher. One court has described emotional distress damages without medical treatment as what's known as garden variety emotional distress. And in that case, the court reviewed dozens of cases where the awards ranged from $5,000 up to $125,000 just for the emotional distress damages portion. Proof of an exact amount of emotional distress is not required. Punitive damages are also available under the Fair Housing Act. It's a lower standard than what's available under like the state laws that deal with punitive damages. The Federal Fair Housing Act punitive damages, the standard is whether the housing provider acted with knowledge that their actions violated the fair housing laws, or if they acted in reckless disregard of somebody's fair housing rights. You can affirmatively obtain a remedy to keep your housing or to obtain housing. You can request policy changes, training for the housing providers to ensure that they know that their obligations under the fair housing laws. There's finally a civil penalty that HUD or the local fair housing investigative agency can impose to vindicate the public interest, right? The state of North Carolina and our cities and the federal government have an interest in ensuring equal housing opportunities and providing for fair housing throughout the United States. And so to vindicate this public interest, they may impose a civil penalty. The 2021 civil penalty for a first instance of a Fair Housing Act violation is over $21,000. And it's not mentioned here, but attorney's fees and costs are also available under the Fair Housing Act. So if a complainant or an individual victim of discrimination prevails on their case, they are entitled to their attorney's fees and costs. And so it can be costly for both the damages portion and the fees portion to engage in discrimination and be found liable under the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. Next, okay, there we go. Oh, sorry. So complainants, there are basically two avenues for enforcing their fair housing rights. So individuals can file an administrative complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development or their state or local human relations commission. As I mentioned, there are 6 in the state of North Carolina. It is a standardized form. It is a 2-page document where the essential facts are written down about what happened, what caused the discrimination, what is the protected class, who engaged in the discriminatory conduct. The individual has 1 year from the last act of discrimination to file a complaint. And an individual does not need an attorney to file an administrative complaint. Louise talked a little bit earlier about the investigative process that the City of Charlotte engages in and how the complaints work in the city. HUD has a very similar process. All the state human relations and local human relations commissions have similar processes for investigating allegations of discrimination in the administrative context. An individual may also just file a lawsuit in federal or state court. There is no standardized forms in that case. You have 2 years from the last act of discrimination, and we would strongly recommend consulting an attorney before filing a lawsuit in court. So we have quite a bit of time for some questions. If people want to submit them through the chat, or I can check in with Teresa.
Yes, Ashley, can you read us some of the questions that we have received in the chat?
Sure. So before lunch, there were some questions that were in the chat, but they were already answered. So right now there's, if the application is rejected because the legal documents do not match the name the prospective tenant is using, can we cause that case as fair housing discrimination under sex?
So I guess I'm not completely understanding. So the person has identity documents, presumably like a driver's license that has one name, but they fill out another name. Is that the question?
I just need clarity from the person there. Yes, that is the question.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's going to depend a lot on the specifics of the situation, I would say. So, a lot of people, have a legal name and then use a different name, right? And so my, legal name, is one thing, and I go by something else. And if the reason the denial the person is being denied is because of their status, if they're using a name that doesn't say match their gender identity or their expectation or their what is assumed to be how they should be, what their gender identity should be, then that could potentially be a type of sex-based discrimination, right? As a type of gender identity discrimination. And so I see in the chat here, the ID says John and the person uses Jennifer. And I think that would be a pretty strong case, I would see, of a type of sex-based discrimination. I mean, it's the person is using a name that doesn't correspond with what is expected of them in terms of what their sex or their gender should be. And so I would see that as a type of sex-based discrimination. One thing to do, I think that in terms of what landlords and providers can do is they can certainly ask for a legal name and then maybe ask people what do you prefer to be called, right? And some people may have a nickname or some other name that they like people to use when they're talking to them.
Okay. Yep. I think that's all the questions we have in the chat.
Okay. And I don't know can people also just unmute themselves or is that something that they don't have the ability to do that if they?
Yes, everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves. So if anyone has comments, questions, please feel free to go ahead and jump in. Oh, wait.
When I see Adolfo there also noted that Winston-Salem passed an ordinance, and we're sorry we didn't mention that one. It's nice to hear.
We'll update our website listing.
Yes, I will be sending out a link to our survey as well as a PDF of the full presentation today. So the question was, will the group be able to have a copy of Legal Aid's presentation? The answer is yes. No other questions? Come on, we've been on here for quite some time. We've said lots of things. No questions at all? Surely you can't make our jobs that easy on us.
It's me again, Adolfo. I was just going to make this comment. I have been kind of asking HUD to give us an example of what would be discriminatory under these new sex discrimination guideline. And I think Legal Aid already did that. And that's why I wanted to have that presentation, because we have at least some idea of what we could cause in these cases. So thank you very much, guys, for doing that job.
Oh, we have another question. So an owner rented to 2 people for $1,000 a month. The tenant asked to add 1 adult and 2 children to the lease. The owner said yes, but they would have to pay an additional $100 per month because they're adding 3 people to the lease. Is that discrimination?
Do you want to take that one, Lauren? Or?
I can. Although my answer is, it depends. It's going to depend on what the owner's policies are for how they calculate rent and whether or not this is only being applied because there's a child as a potential familial status discrimination case. We do. It is suspicious when additional fees are being added and what the justification for those fees are. Is it a water sewer issue or what exactly is going on? So it will likely depend on some additional investigation. Jeff?
No, I'd agree with that. And when I used to do fair housing work in Ohio, there were a number of providers there, a number of properties that would have utility fees based on a per person amount. And so the rent would be $500 for a 1-bedroom plus $25 a month per person for water and sewer or whatever the utilities were. And I don't see that as often here in North Carolina. I think it's much more common to just do it, based on the bedroom, the number of bedrooms. And I think that it's, I can't give legal advice, but I think that Lauren is right that it is potentially very suspicious if they're increasing costs based on the number of individuals, particularly if they're doing it based on the number of children, because it could have a disparate impact and be discriminatory based on familial status. But it really is going to depend on the specifics of their policies and are similar policies, how are they being applied to other tenants in the property? Is this something that's being done to discourage the several children from residing there? Or has it been something that's been going on for years and sort of how is it actually being implemented?
I think just from an investigation standpoint, it's important for you all to know that if we were to receive a complaint that had those sort of facts attached to it, the first thing that we would be looking for as investigators is that comparative data to see, as Lauren mentioned, is this typical? Why have these been added? Are there additional fees when children are added to leases? previously or not? Is this a special circumstance? Does this individual or couple seem to be having additional fees tacked onto them specifically in comparison to others who may or may not have children? So that's the kind of information that we look for when we are investigating cases. You're welcome. The other question, one more question is, what is the best way to ask for references from previous rentals?
From a housing provider, like a tenant asking for a letter, or like the housing provider contacting another housing provider?
I believe the person is meaning a housing provider asking a tenant for rental history. Is that correct, Debbie?
So I guess, well, assuming that that's the case, that it's a landlord wanting to check references, that's something that is permitted. And so a landlord can require a tenant to provide, the name and phone number or address of where he or she has lived in the past. And it's lawful for the landlord to call those people or write to them if they chose to do that, but usually it's calling them and getting a reference and seeing, how were they as a tenant. So that is lawful. Now, as long as they're not basing the decision on any of the protected classes that we've been discussing, that would be lawful to do. There's been concern in a number, in recent years at some landlords that are being, how they do screening based on certain types of court records. And so we didn't talk about it today, but landlords who screen based on criminal history, they need to be very careful about how they do that, because that can be discriminatory if they do it incorrectly. And I don't know, if people have questions, we can get into that. Similarly, in terms of how a landlord might screen based on evictions, they need to be, look at how they're doing that. Is it the fact that someone had a case filed against them doesn't necessarily mean they did anything wrong. And so that, is something that you would want to be, looking at. Is it actual behavior that you're screening, or is it just an allegation of behavior? And I would say that generally you want to treat those types of things differently, and then again, not making any decisions based on protected class membership. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments, feedback? We're here for it all. Lisa is asking to please remind her, what does I and A stand for in LGBTQIA? She says she's finding it difficult to keep up with the acronyms these days. Cameron, I'm gonna
Sure.
throw that one to you, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like I said, this is very fluid and will continue to change even as we talk about, today. Different communities may have different terms that they prefer even now. I stands for intersex, and that is a term for someone who is born, we think about X and XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes. There may be a chromosomal makeup that's a little different than that. They may have, their birth gender, birth sex may not be, determined as easily. So they're intersex. That's sort of, that covers those folks. And then A is for asexual. And these are people who don't experience sexual attraction to anyone. They may still have relationships, may still have romantic pairings, but they don't experience sexual attraction at all. And you're right that there are lots of letters as we continue to add in. And I think that speaks to a lot about where we are discussing identity, that there's so many groups that have felt unheard, underrepresented for so long, that we do keep updating this too. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Well, while I'm waiting for you all to come up with some burning questions for us, I will shamelessly plug our brochures that we have. So thankfully, HUD has kindly provided us with lots of funding to be able to do some education and outreach. So if you are a landlord, property manager, or just anyone in the community who knows of a place where our brochures might be able to be placed for anyone to view, please go ahead and let us know. I will share our contact information, which will also be included in this presentation. We have hundreds of brochures. We have them in English, Spanish. Luis, you may have to help me out. Sorry. English, Spanish, Arabic, French,
Arabic,
Vietnamese.
Hmong, and Vietnamese. Yes. So we have disability brochures, and we also have our main general brochures that have fun facts about fair housing and our local ordinance in there. So we're just trying to put ourselves out there more, making sure that people are getting the information that they need from us, knowing who we are, how to contact us, and connecting them with whatever additional resources that we can in terms of housing, especially fair housing. Well, that worked. So we have one more question. If an owner asks us to find a tenant at a home near UNCC, but they don't want a group of students to rent the home because they are concerned that the students won't take care of the property, would that be discriminating if I assume, are you asking, Dean, as from a property management standpoint? Yes. Okay. So would the property management company be discriminating if they refuse to rent to 3 or 4 students?
So I would generally say that students are not one of those 7 categories that the Federal Fair Housing Act has laid out. And so if it's just because they're students, then I think a housing provider could generally deny them.
Yeah, and I would agree. The one thing I will point out is that we have had a couple of cases against apartment complexes that I think were trying to do that, but they worded their advertising as saying that the complex was a 21 and over complex. And so they were, I think, attempting to keep out students. But in that language, they were actually keeping out not only students who were 18, 19, 20 years old, but also potentially children. And even if they say that they would have offered it to a couple who might have had a young child or any age of child, a lot of families might have been discouraged from even applying there if they saw that advertisement. And so they need to be very careful if they're looking to do that in terms of the language that they use, so that it's not mistaken, it's not misleading or unclear in terms of who they're trying to market to.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. We have 2, well, Jeff just mentioned in the chat that they also have fair housing brochures on their website. That's fairhousingnc.org. And then we have a question. If a person uses a different name, what is the best way for a landlord to establish that the person is not committing fraud without causing any type of discrimination?
I mean, I think that communication is really what I would focus on, right? And so I think a lot of landlords now use some type of background check. And if you're using a company to do that, sometimes the report that you get will indicate other names that are being used. The other thing is just talking to the person and asking them. I mean, I think that I think it makes sense that landlords might want would want to have, I think I said this before, but a legal name, just because they're a lease is a legal document. But it can be expensive and time consuming to change someone's legal name. And so if they're going by a different name, whether it's because they have a different gender identity or for whatever other reason, people don't always do that through the legal process. And so just asking the person, are there other names that you've used? And I think a lot of applications often do indicate or do have a question about that. And so I think just communication is what I would say for that.
Thank you, Jeff. We have another question. A landlord only likes to rent to Section 8 voucher holders and wondering if saying voucher holders only or voucher holders preferred on his marketing flyer, is he discriminating?
So I'll jump in here, and Lauren and Jeff, please correct me or jump in as you feel necessary. Currently, a source of income is not a protected class at least within our jurisdiction. So I don't believe that saying that you're preferring to market to voucher holders is discriminatory, although you do have to be careful because there can be some disparate impact depending on additional protected classes. So sometimes if we get a call from someone saying, I think I was discriminated against because I have a voucher, we may not be able to take that case based on source of income discrimination, but we can ask other questions in terms of whether or not that person falls into additional protected classes. And then we would investigate that based on whether there are, terms and conditions or rental denial based on our other protected classes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, usually you see it the opposite, where you see landlords saying no Section 8 accepted, and so people who are using vouchers often have a very difficult time finding housing and finding a place that is that's safe and decent and in a neighborhood that they like, and so people often struggle with that. So actually hearing that there are landlords who are looking for Section 8 voucher holders is nice, just because it's usually the opposite. I mean, I think that, putting in an ad saying, Section 8 vouchers, welcomed or accepted or something like that is certainly fine to do. A lot of housing authorities keep lists of landlords that do accept vouchers because, again, the tenants are often having a hard time finding landlords who do accept those. So making sure you're on those lists would be perfectly acceptable as well. So, but it's the opposite of the problem that I think most voucher holders run into. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I would definitely say that in terms of trying to avoid discriminatory statements, use of absolutes in advertising for housing is to avoid that as much as you can. So things like only, maybe not using that word. Lauren, I don't know if I interrupted you. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to give one caveat to the no source of income protection or prohibition against discrimination in North Carolina. And you noted the potential disparate impact claim there, but low-income housing tax credit properties cannot discriminate because of source of income discrimination, or because of source of income. So low-income housing tax credit property cannot refuse to rent to someone because they have a voucher. And so it would be a slightly different claim in those properties. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, Teresa?
No, go ahead.
Were you going to say something else? Because we have another question in the chat.
Nope, I was going to read the question, but you're on it.
Okay. Is it discrimination to ask so this is, I guess, just clarity from the first question regarding names. So is it discrimination to ask that a tenant uses their legal name as it appears on driver's license or ID on documents such as leases?
I guess I don't see that as discrimination, as long as you're not treating someone differently because of one of their protected class memberships. So their sex, in this case, I think it would be most likely. Then I don't see that as discrimination. If you were to, if a landlord were to sort of engage in harassment of a tenant because they had a different gender identity than what is on their official license or their official documentation. That could be a type of discrimination. But I guess I don't see it as on the lease itself requiring the legal name to be there as a type of discrimination. But I would say that a landlord should probably, use the preferred name and preferred pronouns and other identifiers of a tenant when they're not on those types of legal documents.
I think it's also good to present people with options. So Jeff had mentioned that, a person you can maybe have on your application, your name as it appears on your government issued ID, as well as, what you prefer to be called. So, providing people with options to allow that inclusion, I think is a great practice.
If I might go back to the point Jeff was making earlier, and Teresa as well, as long as the landlord is consistent in what he or she is asking or requiring of the potential tenant, then it more likely than not is not discrimination. It is only when you change that from time to time, where you require a legal name be given, and then at other times you may not require that. As long as you're consistent, if you consistently say you don't have to give your legal name, and that applies to everybody, then as far as discrimination goes, you are fine. If you consistently ask for the legal name, and you're consistent in that, regardless of the prospective tenant, then you would be fine. It may not make any sense, but you're fine as long as you're consistent.
And for those of you who do not know, you all have had a special treat today. That is our fearless leader, Mr. Willie Ratchford, our Executive Director of the Community Relations Department. He has joined us. So thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Teresa.
Any other questions? We still have quite a bit of time, so any additional information anyone would like to share, or any questions or comments, we'd be more than happy to hear.
Willie, someone said that you're a Jedi Master in the comments.
That's a really nice way of saying he's old, y'all.
He didn't call you Yoda, at least.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and we do have one more Wordle text to poll that we would love for you all to participate in. So if you could please, again, pull out your phones and text Willie R 456 to recipient 22333, and not that one, this one. That seems to have. If you could please tell us in one word how you are leaving this session today. Oh, enlightened, that's good. Informed. Energized. That's good. That's because we gave you that good lunch break. You didn't get too sleepy. And while folks are doing that, I do want to go ahead and remind everyone that you will be receiving an email from us later this evening with a link to submit to our survey for some feedback on how this training went. And we'll also be sending you copies of our presentation. Exhausted. It's been a long year.
That wasn't me, I promise.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for participating. Are there any other last burning questions? Oh, thank you, Pamela. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to spend some time with us talking about fair housing. I think we all have kind of drilled it home, but we'll go ahead and say it one more time. This has really been a great time, and we want to make sure that you all understand that we are here not just to investigate your cases or anything like that. We're here to help. Any questions that you have, you always can reach out to us. You'll have our contact information when we send that information out as well. So anything that we can ever do fair housing related, please reach out to us. We are an important resource that we sometimes might be underutilized, but now I'll say that, and we'll have a million phone calls coming in tomorrow. So please utilize us, contact us for whatever you need, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you again, Jeff, Lauren, and Cameron, so much. And everyone have a wonderful day.
Teresa, do you want to re-invite them to the Fair Chance housing that's coming
Yes,
up?
I do. Thank you, Willie. We to continue our celebration of Fair Housing Month, we will be having a another conference, which I will send out. I can also send out more information about on April 28th. I believe that's a Tuesday. That the focus of that will be fair chance housing, so criminal background and housing discrimination. So we'll be talking about that and pushing a lot of education and outreach on criminal backgrounds in relation to fair housing.
Okay, that's on the 28th, right? So that's a Wednesday.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Yes, a Wednesday, not a Tuesday. April 28th. Well, thank you so much. Anything else I might have forgotten, team?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lauren, Jeff, Cameron, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.